Welcome everybody. So I looked at the attendee list. So we've got people from Europe, Middle East, and Australia, New Zealand who've joined us. So for those who haven't attended one of our webinars before, so we've been running these webinars for about 3 years, and generally we have between 2 or 3 of these a year, and we've been so lucky because for each one we tried to get people to present from different parts of the world, just to promote that diversity of thought. And that's very important today. You will hear things that you will agree with, you will hear things maybe you disagree with. Today is about diversity of thought, listening to different ideas and opinions, and then there will be a question and answer session at the end as well. We've got, in terms of today's timing, so I have a few slides just to kick things off. Then we'll have Matthew from Australia speaking, then Francis here in the Middle East, and thirdly Dave in the UK. And as I said, then we'll have the Q&A session. So in terms of the questions, if you could on the chat, so if you've got a question, send them to me via chat. What I will do then is I'll pull the questions together, group them together at the end. So I will ask the questions on your behalf. If for some reason the chat isn't working, just send it by email. So dfpmullin@hotmail.com. So either email or by chat. Just drop the questions in as the presentations go through. We will answer or ask all of the questions at the end of all 3 presentations. But feel free to drop your questions as they come through. So the webinar is being recorded, and what we'll do is for everybody who has registered, we will send out a link to the webinar sometime next week. The questions we've gone through, and thank yous. So this is quite important. I'll say this now, and I'll say it again, is in terms of thank yous, you know, these webinars really only happen for 2 main reasons. One, the presenters. So a big thank you to the 3 presenters today who've invested their time pulling together the presentations. Also the IRM as well. So we've got Rory in the background who helped sort of organize and sort of administer a lot of this. And these would not happen without the IRM support. And thirdly, the attendees. So at the minute, we've got over 50 attendees. So far, that number will go up and down as we go through, and it's great to see so many joining us and supporting these webinars as well. So safety, we always start these webinars for those who've joined with a safety message, and this is the safety message I used at our first webinar, as I said 3 years ago. And every webinar I go to change it, and I said I must put something more relevant on, more topical, but every time I cannot change this slide. And it's quite scary, this, because you think about it, you know, the interest group is on infrastructure. Infrastructure traditionally involves an element of construction, and when you look at the figures, sort of, and I think in terms of mental health week as well, mental health awareness week, is something we don't think about. So we think about construction and we think about people hurting themselves physically, but we don't think about this, the mental side as well. So a few links there. You can go away, have a look, and I've referenced some material both from the UK and from Australia as well. Quite scary. Also, I put this up as well. It's a useful resource in terms of looking at infrastructure projects globally. It also looks at maturity of infrastructure delivery in terms of different parts of the world. The link is at the bottom. Again, a useful resource if you haven't used it, to go on and look at what's happening around the world across different sectors and regions. A little bit of PR for us as a special interest group. So as a group, our chair is Wes Cadby in the UK, and as a group, this is what we try and do. Ultimately, we're trying to help improve project performance with a slant in the infrastructure domain, and in particular, it's about improving the application of risk management, and hence the webinars are about sharing good practice, different ideas how to do things. And as I said, it's all about shaping and forming that good practice globally. And in terms of today, it's really for people who just have an interest in risk. You don't have to be a risk manager or have risk in your title. If you've got an interest in risk management, hopefully you will learn something today. It's about sharing experiences, thought leadership, and most importantly as well, sort of sharing that network of professionals. So we have a group on LinkedIn, so feel free to join that. And also each of the speakers. So when the speakers are on, you'll see their names, add them on LinkedIn. Maybe if your question doesn't get covered today, feel free to message them directly on LinkedIn as well. Good. So on that note, less of me, and we will move over to the first presentation from Matthew. So I'll just get it up on the screen first, and then I will unmute. So
you should be able to hear me now.
Yeah, I can hear you. So just check. So can you see your slides, Matthew?
Yep.
Excellent. So I'll go on mute now. So don't forget, as Matthew goes through his presentation, either email or drop through any questions to me on chat. Thank you. So over to you, Matthew.
Okay, so I put together a few slides and a few thoughts around risk and complexity, something I've been taking a look at over the last couple of years. I don't know, next slide. Here, no. There we go. So just that's a little bit about me. So I'm currently working at Lendlease. It's a global property company. If you haven't heard of us before, we do property development, construction, and some investment management. About 12,000 employees, operations. We're an Australian company with operations in Europe, the UK, America, Asia. Basically what I'm going to go through today, a little bit about my role first. So I'm a delivery portfolio manager. So I'm sitting over circa 200 projects with values from around 10 million to about $8 billion. Full range of risk profiles from fee-based projects to single stage design and construct, EPCM. And my group owns the policy of operations globally and a lot of the reporting systems, and we report up to the Lendlease board. So today I'm looking to go through what I mean about risk management, or where I want to focus, some basics of complexity, a classification system that I'm suggesting. I'm going to try to link it to decision theory quickly, and then put together how a framework like this can help. So next slide. So most people, a lot of focus is on the first three steps, using whether, it's bow tie or pre-mortems or whatever, to get some pretty good information about what are the key risks in a job, in a project. And it usually ends up in a big spreadsheet, and then there's some very top-end reporting that happens, unfortunately, in my experience. So, so if we step to the next slide, what I'm looking to focus on is taking that data and using it. And again, it'll drive into this complexity piece, but once you get that data about risks, you can start looking at it over time, by value or criticality or location, and you'll get very different insights. And a key aspect of this is that visualizing data does drive very significant impacts and insights that can significantly change how you're going to react to a risk. So next slide. So setting the scene about project environments, in the sector that I'm in, which is I think quite a few people, but we have digital engineering that's sort of taking over how projects are run. And that is just the definitions on the screen: a collaborative way of working using digital processes that enable productive methods of planning, designing, constructing, operating, and maintaining assets. Next. So in the background, in the engine room, really what's happening is people are being linked in real time to different databases, and that environment, the interfaces, how they do interact is a very complex aspect of how we manage projects now. So you can imagine somebody who's working in a design model changing how something is going to be manufactured, brought to site, and part of the final asset. You know, a keystroke can then have massive impacts for time, which could push work out into a rainy season or a cyclone season, which could have dramatic impacts to the overall project performance. Next slide. So just as sort of in summary, just to sort of set the scene, you know, the environment of today is fairly complex. It's constantly changing. Systems that we use are hardly influenced by the environment in which they operate. It's hard to predict how change in one part will influence the whole, and properties may manifest that are not exhibited by individual parts. Next. So this gets us to this aspect of a complex environment, and there's been a lot of work to try and define complexity in different ways. There's really two main components that I find in any definition, and there's lots around. One is that the system cannot be fully understood simply by analyzing its components, and that relationships are not fixed, that they shift and change. Now, they do share fundamental behaviors, and that's what allows us to sort of organize and manage them a little bit. And three key ones are on the screen there. So emergence, adaptation, and a nonlinear aspect. I won't go through all of that, but you've got it there. So those three things are the things that sort of define the complexity of an environment. So next. So there are many models to try and take that next step and take that ambiguity and try to classify it and drill down into it a little bit. There's one that's called Sifter. There's the Hellman Institute. There's many others. I choose one that was the simplest one I could find because I like simple. And it defined things by four aspects. So structural, so numerous interconnected tasks and activities. Technical, which is unique design challenges or techniques without precedent. Directional, hidden agendas, misaligned goals, pure project definition, and process uncertainty. Timing or environmental conditions that create uncertainty in a process. And a key thing that I found that was very good in this classification is that it aligned to how the organizations that I've worked with, how they respond to complexity. So next. So using that classification, I took a very generic construction sector sort of view of a project lifecycle and tried to just base the complexity on a typical environment. And you know, no project is typical, but in my space, we do a lot of EPCM work. So that's the design and construction phases and commissioning phases of what you're seeing. And when I did my analysis, I came up with go to the next slide, the following trend graphs. So of all the data that I pulled together and the views that I took on complexity, I saw different trends of those four aspects of complexity, and I found that they ebbed and flowed in and out of a project at different times. So on that top left, structural. So in the design phase, you had a lot of interfaces with external stakeholders that drove a spike in complexity. During the construction phase, the number of interrelated tasks, depending on the size of the project, would drive higher complexity. And in the commissioning phase, again, you'd have a lot of interfaces with external stakeholders. Directional, the purple line below it, would have a different view of how that complexity came in and out of the project. And based on the leadership impact on the project team and the other items listed there. Technical, no surprise, in the design phase, you'd expect a pretty big spike in complexity as you're reviewing all the different designs and alternative options. And then there's always a process and time related aspect, which is the blue one on the bottom. So those were the ones that I had put together in my analysis, and the key aspect is that the interrelation of each one of those is really what drives when you have issues and risks on the project. So next. So very quickly, as you get to that, the quick link to decision theory. So any decisions, there's always a point where you're trying to make them too early, and there's a point where it's too late. In too early, what that feels like is, cultures that somebody wants immediate action. There's a lot of unknown unknowns, results in the overuse of committees, and there's a real lack of detail that reduces accountability. When you're making decisions too late, you've got a culture of rewarding heroic efforts. There's continual firefighting, planning activities are not valued, and there's usually a reluctance to delegate. So an aspect of complexity and project management in general is getting a feel for when is the right time to make key decisions along a project lifecycle. So next slide. So this is just how what I've done with this framework. So this breaking complexity down into these 4 aspects. I've used that to create a systematic approach to automating the identification and assessment of complexity. I've then used that to use the current project controls that exist in Lendlease or existed in Lendlease previous to this exercise to create a sensitivity to that complexity. And that allowed us to use the same structures and reporting structures and controls, but just expanded their purview a little bit. That helped to generate a framework with how aspects of the IT environment would interface with operations and create what I'm calling a data pipeline. So this was creating measure points and expanding them to try and grasp how that complexity would be in those phases of the project. Where I am in my process, my next steps are enhancing the operation controls to leverage that data pipeline and creating a line of sight between the head office, the project, and the coalface workforce decisions. The goal that I've got is that through this, we'll get a sense of, or at least an awareness of the capacity of an organization to deal with complexity. And that in itself will allow this velocity of risks to be part of key decision-making that happens in an organization. So hopefully that wasn't too quick for you. I didn't have much time, but that's pretty much it for me. There's a lot more behind that, and happy to answer any questions through emails or anything that you want to send to me. So thank you very much.
Excellent. Thanks, Matthew. So again, so just a reminder, send any sort of questions through to me, and then I'll wrap them all up together for the end for Matthew. Bear in mind where Matthew is, it's after 5 in the evening. So a big thank you for Matthew. So Matthew, if you can stay on, and then at the end we will have the group Q&A session. So sort of a silent clap from behind your screens for Matthew. So excellent. So next up, so if I just put Matthew on mute, and I will unmute Francis. Just do a quick comms check, Francis. Can you hear me?
Yes, I can.
Excellent.
Can you hear me?
I can hear you fine. So let's get Francis up. So we're going to try, so partway through Francis's presentation, we're going to sort of trial a little bit of something on the internet, and hopefully it works. It worked. If it doesn't work this time, it did work during the practice session.
Yes, it did work.
So on that note, can you see your slides?
Yes, I can.
Excellent. So I'll go on mute and I'll hand it over to you, Francis.
Okay, thanks. Hello, everyone. Good morning, afternoon, or evening, wherever you are. Before I start, I just want to say a big thank you to Darren for organizing this. He's been quite helpful for me since I came to the Middle East about a year ago, and I think he's doing great work organizing these webinars and also coordinating all the work that's been done here in the Bahrain and Saudi Arabia region for IRM. So before I start again, I would like to just give you a little background about myself. So I started my career in the project world, I believe over 17 years ago now. Started off as a highway engineer and then moved into project management. Then I did a stint as a decision scientist, and finally, for the past, I would say 8 to 9 years, I've been specialized in risk management, so project risk management. So in that time, I've worked in the railways in the UK, aviation, power, and also the public sector as well. So my current role is working on the Saudi Customs Enterprise Project Management Office contract for AECOM. So AECOM is a global company with about 86,000 employees across the world, and they had the first contract in Saudi Arabia to essentially help the improvement of project management practice within government entities. So this all in terms of bringing best practice into delivery of projects within the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia. So that cuts across project management, quality management, and risk management. So all the elements of project management essentially. Next slide, please. Okay, so just a brief overview of what I'm going to talk about. So essentially, my presentation today is about the road to effective risk management, tools of engagement. So usually my area of expertise and essentially focus has always been the quantitative side of things. So quantitative schedule risk analysis, quantitative cost risk analysis. Some of the stuff Matthew talked about, complexity, decision theory. So a lot of the numerical stuff. But in the past few years, I have come to realize that a lot of these quantitative methods and applications of risk don't quite translate very well in every organization. Depending on the kind of organization you're dealing with, you might have to be agile enough to change your style, change the way you approach things. So today is essentially about looking at some of the tools that you can use to overcome the barriers to effective risk management. So these are from my experiences across the UK and within Saudi Arabia as well. Okay, next slide, please. So just in terms of my experience to date, so I've worked with probably 6 or 7 different types of organizations, and there's a wide spectrum of understanding of risk management and integration as well. So you can see there on the right, we've got on the extreme side, so 2 extremes would probably one is on the left side, which is the solo flying. So where you have a risk management function sitting separately from the rest of the organization, and on the other side of the spectrum, you've got a risk management function that sits within the wider context of organization. So that means decisions are based on risk metrics. So every decision that's made includes some kind of risk metric. So there's risk-based decision making. There's an integration of project risk with, for example, enterprise risk. So they are not 2 separate functions that don't talk to each other. So you can say that's a value-adding red arrow formation. So that's the aspiration for most organizations, to get to a point where risk is not just a tick box exercise or a compliance requirement, but it informs a lot of the decisions the company makes, and senior management, executives, everyone in the organization is aware of the company's risk exposure. But what I would say, depending whether it's an immature or a mature risk management in an organization, what is common is that it always needs strengthening. The culture of risk management always needs strengthening, and that's a softer side that a lot of risk managers seem to ignore, from my experience. So what does that mean? So in terms of strengthening culture, I'm talking about strengthening the behaviors. So behaviors become habits. So people not just we have very little time in terms of contact time with people we work with. So for example, in my environment, on average, you'd have an hour a month to talk to a project manager or program manager about risk. So what happens for the rest of that period that you're not in contact with that person? Do they have the right behaviors to actually identify risks and to contribute to a risk management process? And also resources has always been a big barrier to effective risk management, because I think most of you agree with me that wherever you work, risk management, you don't have a lot of risk managers. You probably have maximum 2 or 3 in a huge organization managing risks within projects and within enterprise risks. Communication and obviously full senior management support as well. So a lot of the work we do requires the support of senior management. And without that, nothing you do would add value as a whole to the organization. Okay, so next slide, please. So what are the barriers that I keep referring to? So these are from my experience, and I'm happy to share some of the barriers you faced in your career. But these are the ones that I have faced so far. So the first one is around the level of engagement. So I talked a bit about different levels of engagement. So you've got project participants, so that's your program managers, project managers, engineers, people you probably embedded in with and work with on a daily basis, external stakeholders, internal stakeholders, and also senior management. So for every kind of risk management intervention, so a risk workshop, a risk review, do you have the right level of engagement? Are the decision makers there to advise on mitigation actions? Do you have the right people at your workshops? Do you have the means to engage the depth and breadth of stakeholders that you require? So these are the kind of barriers that people face and I have faced in my career to date. The next one that I want to highlight is cultural inertia. So essentially that's a big word for, or a big phrase for, we've always done things this way, so why should we change? All right, so this is about the reluctance to adopt and embrace risk management as a process that goes beyond a tick box exercise. Okay. The next one that I want to highlight is cognitive bias. So this is essentially prejudgments. So things that we are stuck with as people based on the environment. So one that comes to mind that happens quite a lot, especially in quantitative risk workshops, is anchoring bias, for example. So when you go into a risk workshop and you're talking numbers, numbers in terms of durations and costs and stuff like that, there's always the anchoring bias, because once you mention a number, everyone anchors around that number. So you have, for example, plus or minus a certain duration, right? So all these kind of things can impede how effective your risk management workshops are. Okay, so next one will be knowledge and understanding. So one of the peculiar things about risk management is there's nobody you meet in an organization, or I've rarely seen someone who doesn't know what risk management is or what risks are. So everyone has their perspective on what risk is. So trying to educate someone or trying to align them to what risk management is in terms of a project, in terms of enterprise risk, can prove difficult, because they might have a mindset that it's already fixed to a certain perspective of risk. So a good example of this is trying to distinguish between safety risk and project risk, right? So safety risk, so some of my safety colleagues would know about how we use similar tools in terms of risk assessments to assess the kind of risk that you have in the safety world. But trying to explain the difference between how it's applied in project risk and how it's applied in the safety world can be a challenge a lot of the time. And then lastly, data quality as well. So not every organization has the means to be able to put together enough money to essentially have a database where you can actually put in risk data and have it audited and have it checked. So a lot of the times data quality can also be an issue within risk management. So I've given all the problems. So what kind of solutions are there out there that can help you overcome these barriers? Okay, so next slide, please. This is by no means an exhaustive list. I've just put some of the ones I've used recently, which have been effective in overcoming some of the barriers I've just outlined. So I'm just going to go through each one of them. The first one is around the use of interactive engagement tools. So you remember I said earlier, when you are limited by various constraints in terms of getting the right people at the table, workshops, the amount of contact time you have with senior management. So if you have a workshop which requires a big decision, are you going to be able to have the attention of a CFO or CEO for an hour, right? Very unlikely. So that's where some of these things come in, an interactive engagement tool. So I'll show you one that I've prepared, so we can try it out and see what you guys think about it. Next one is the use of risk champions. So that addresses the issue of resources. So remember I talked about the fact that most risk functions in organizations are not adequately resourced. So you don't have the right number of people to effect the kind of change that you require to have an effective risk management process. So the second one is about risk champions. So using existing resources to, if you like, spread the word about risk. And the next one is using something called an RBS. So it's a graphical hierarchical identification template. So that helps address some of the issues around knowledge and understanding. So trying to understand or trying to standardize the way you capture risks. So people have a standard way of capturing and understanding risk. So this is quite a helpful tool as well, using an RBS. And last but not the least, brainstorming. So it's a little twist on brainstorming that helps to take away some of the biases that can happen when you have a group of people who are you haven't got the right mix of people. So round robin, I'll explain that as well. Okay, so next slide, please. Okay, so interactive engagement, the first one. So I've already talked about some of the attributes of interactive engagement, but what stands out there for me is the fact that you can widen the scope of the engagement, right? It's anonymous as well. So some people might not feel comfortable speaking in an open forum, no matter how much you encourage that. Some people might not feel comfortable talking in front of their managers or people who they report to. So the fact that it's anonymous enhances communication across all levels. Probably two of the key features that make it an amazing way of overcoming some of the barriers that I highlighted earlier. It's also worth noting that there's quite a lot of these tools around, but the one that I have used effectively recently, it's called Mentimeter. So Mentimeter is an interactive engagement tool that's used mostly for conferences. And can you see me? Yeah. So yeah, mostly used for conferences, and I find it quite useful in my risk workshop and my risk reviews to help do all the things that I've listed there. So risk ranking, building consensus, engagement, tracking and auditing as well. So there's features as well there that allow you to export data and analyze it and look at any insights there that can help decision making. So what I want to do next is to give you, let's go to the next slide. What I want to do next is to give you a chance to, and give me a chance as well to understand what your thoughts are on the barriers to effective risk management from your perspective. So let's run a little demo. So what you see there is the how it will look like. So this is the initial screen on the Mentimeter. So I've got one set up in the background. I'm going to switch to it very soon, but I want to give you a chance to go to the website that's on the slide there. So all the w's.menti.com, and use the code. So you can forget that code there. There's a new code. So the code is 250554. So 250554. So go to menti.com. I'll give everyone a couple of minutes to do that, so we can see the live results as they're coming in. So all the w's.menti.com. You can do it on your laptop, on your tablet, or your phone. Go to menti.com and use the code 250554. Okay. So I'll just wait a minute while I switch to the screen. So I think, Darren, I'm ready to switch to the screen.
Okay. So hopefully this works.
Yes.
Right. So if I make a new presenter.
Okay. Excellent. So we've had, what do you have in? So can everyone see what's happening? So we've got 18 people already. 20. Okay. So we got. So at the moment it looks like yeah, it's a straight fight between level of engagement and cultural inertia. All right. So I'm expecting 62 answers approximately. We've got 63 people on the call. Yeah, so we've got 26 now. So you can see there's a counter that tells you how many people have put in their answers. Okay. Right, so it's looking like a level of engagement. Level of engagement. Okay, right, so I think I would like to continue with the presentation. I'll let everyone know what the final output was. So I'll go back to the, can we go back to the presentation, please, Darren?
Yes.
So I'll stop sharing my screen.
Okay. So can you see your slides?
Not yet. Yeah. Yeah, it's back on now. We're back.
Excellent.
Okay, so I think it's stuck in the corner at the moment. Okay, so I'll keep monitoring the Mentimeter in the background, but the next tool in the arsenal that can be very effective in overcoming the barriers that I described is the use of risk champions. So a lot of organizations have risk champions, but what's key here is making sure that your risk champions have a clear terms. They have clear terms of reference and mandate, and you've got the expectations laid out. So you can't quite see it, but that's what's captured in the document on the right. So this goes to both the line manager and the risk champion themselves, just to formalize what exactly is expected of them, the level of input in terms of number of hours a month or number of hours a week that's required on average. So that that's quite helpful in making sure that everybody knows what they're in for and whether they can commit to it long term. And also, there's also a program of recognition and reward for risk champions that I've implemented in my current organization, which has also been very helpful. So it helps recognize some of the good work they're doing in terms of spreading the word about risk, capturing some of the concerns of team members about specific areas of risk management process, and also having tailored training. So what you find a lot of the times is that the training that you carry out for project participants or organization, probably an hour or two, people forget because they don't apply it on a daily basis. But when you have somebody within the team who can be the go-to person, either to answer questions directly about risk or to communicate or escalate it through the risk champion process to myself or one of my team members. So that's tailored training is quite important to make sure that these risk champions, they have tailored training that will help them to be more confident in transmitting some of the messages from the risk management function. And then we have also make sure that we have regular meetings, fortnightly coordination meetings, where there's a forum for discussing and escalating some of the things that I've highlighted. Okay, next slide, please. So in my introduction, in my earlier part of the presentation, I referred to the risk breakdown structure, or the RBS. So this is a very useful tool in terms of standardizing terminology and making sure that you've got a common understanding of risks, how you describe risks, how you define risks. So this is an example from, I've used the same format across 3 organizations, including the current one I'm working with, and it proved very helpful, both as an aid memoir in terms of making sure that your risk workshops are comprehensive enough to capture the full range of risks that could happen on a project, and also, more important, to standardize the way we think about risk. So this is a very useful tool as well. And as I put there in the last column there, the last bullet point there, it also evolves as risk maturity increases. So this just looks at the project. So there's a separate one for the enterprise as a whole, and there's also a separate one for cost estimating. So some of the different sections have developed their own risk breakdown structure based on their experiences, and this has been facilitated by having risk champions. So we've got risk breakdown structure for the key elements of the project organization. Okay, next one, please. Right, so last but not the least, round robin. So workshops and risk reviews usually take the form of a brainstorming session, but one of the key disadvantages of a brainstorming session is that there might be people there who would not speak or not express their opinions unless you essentially try to force them to, or not, or try to push them to. You have to push some people quite a lot to get useful information at a workshop. So round robin is an enhancement on a typical brainstorming session, where rather than being facilitated and led by yourself, what you do is create teams of 3 or 4 people with usually use a lot of the tools around. So we use tools that you use in a workshop, the same tools. So using the Blackboard and stuff like that, and essentially going from each group, you have to make sure you have the right mix of people. So making sure that you have the right mix of people, then ensure that your brainstorming session through the round robin method, it's as effective as it can be. Okay, thank you. So next one, please. So I think that in short is what I've got for you today. I just want to update you on where we are in terms of my question. So we still haven't got the the full complement, but after 43 answers, I can confidently say that cultural inertia is the biggest barrier to effective risk management.
So excellent segue, because we've got a few questions coming up at the end as well. So Francis, on that note, amazing stuff.
Thank you
excellent presentation. And again, everybody, a silent round of applause from behind your screens. And so next up will be Dave Taylor. So if you can unmute yourself, just do a quick comms check. You're on.
Okay. We're live.
Excellent. I can hear you. Right. So can you see your slide, first slide?
Can do, yeah.
Excellent. So I'll go back on mute and I'll hand over to Mr. Taylor.
Grand, thank you. Hi, everyone. David Taylor, work for Mace, Associate Director in Project Controls. So if we go to the next slide, please. My presentation is going to be on running an effective QSRA. I didn't want to do a process guide. I wanted to do more of a discursive piece. It's purely, mainly an opinion piece on the fact that how to communicate and disseminate your results of a QSRA and make sure that the process of doing the QSRA is effective relies largely upon the context upon which the QSRA is instructed and how it's managed, rather than the method of assessment, which tools you use or how you do the QSRA. So context, not technique, is everything when undertaking a QSRA and delivering effective results. Next, please. A little bit about me. It's not a great photo, but such is life. I did an MSc in risk management in 2003, so I've been working in risk for 15 years, and I've recently moved into a project controls role for Network Rail. Previous experience has been through aerospace sectors, nuclear, rail, oil and gas. I've been about. Thanks. Okay, so out of the QSRAs and many sort of iterations of them that I've done, I found that an awful lot of my analysis has fallen flat on its face. This is largely because it's been an internal report for risk as a function, or a project's general requirement to run a QSRA, rather than a driven, targeted, focused piece of work. Let me just put my notes quickly, sorry, it's come off. So the critical part to an effective QSRA is making sure that you have appropriate executive support. This isn't the program director has asked you to do a QSRA. It's that the program director knows why he wants a QSRA done and what he's going to, rather than target it and say, I want this analysis to show me this result, which we've all had, I'm sure. It's more that he understands that the value of the analysis is going to help him make a form of decision. So yeah, my first point is it's critical that the QSRA has an effective sponsor. The sponsor therefore needs to be a knowledgeable person about QSRA, what it's going to do for them, potentially what the process is. He doesn't have to, clearly you're not expecting them to be an expert. So my 3 points under that are why the QSRA is being undertaken, buy into the value of the analysis that it's going to give him and that it will be a valuable investment of the program team's time. Not, if very few people turn up or you get low engagement into the process, the results, it's pointless to go through the process of undertaking a QSRA, both from a risk person's point of view and from the audience that are going to take part and read the results. So my sort of sub points to this are, a sponsor needs to have the 3 T's. They need to have training, they need to have trust, and they need to understand the target. critically, you can't train everyone, and certainly you can't train everyone in how to interpret and use a QSRA. But a sponsor for a QSRA should understand why and how the outputs are going to be valuable to their process and their decision making going forward. Lastly, they need to be firmly aware of, oh, sorry, I didn't do what the outcomes of the analysis will tell them. Okay, the likelihood of completion on time, how accurate that output will be, because we all know that it's as good as the information that goes in, and the level of quality is very dependent on the analysis that's undertaken. Lastly, they need to be aware of how to communicate the results of the analysis. This isn't there isn't a simple fix for this. This isn't, we can write a QSRA report, a discipline-based risk report, but rarely does that land at the right level to influence executive decision making. It needs someone with program influence to take the outputs that we're providing and present them in a suite of presentation material to show the potentially negative outcome of a QSRA and make sure that that lands at an appropriate time for people to make a decision that will support the program going forward. The sponsor themselves need to be an influential person within the program. The QSRA output has to have direction. It shouldn't be the report should be targeted on what we're looking for, but it certainly should not be influenced in driving the result. So, we as a function remain unbiased. The QSRA needs to support the program making an effective decision about the delivery based on the outcome. So, in many circumstances, I've undertaken a QSRA and it's provided significantly detrimental outputs to the program narrative that the project managers are often trying to prescribe. They're often, we're on time, on cost, on quality, they're optimistic, the nature is there. However, if a QSRA is received in the right way by the right audience, it should help them support decisions that show that they're possibly not on the right track for cost, time, and quality. Next slide, please. Okay, timing is everything. Okay, this alludes a little bit back to Matthew's presentation earlier. If you do your QSRA too early or too late, you can or cannot influence the program in the right way. We need to interact with the planning process. We need to allow an appropriate level of detail to be matured into the schedules. If we're working off a bid program or an early phase program, there won't be the level of detail that you can effectively analyze the type of risk. You won't have the information, you won't have the project team engagement. Most programs that I've been working on recently are undertaking a form of rolling wave planning. The later detail is speculative. It's much more, it's summary bar rather than the detailed work that you can do in the immediate phase. So you have to allow the rolling wave to start moving before you can undertake an effective analysis within a program, allowing the maturity of the information in the programs to develop. Second part of that is we need feedback from the delivery teams. You need to understand what's going well, what's not going well, how to interpret the information of what's happening on site in the construction program. This provides delivery insights. Otherwise, we are always going to make too many assumptions about performance of certain contractors, the driving elements of the program. We might look at things that are procured from reliable sources and assume that there's no risk on those chains. However, COVID, etc., are impacting supply chains significantly, whereas your local workforce can still be working. That you need that interaction with the actual to drive an effective QSRA. If we have no feedback, we've got very little information to influence the analysis over and above the initial bid programs. So we need to let the program mature. And with that, we get a deeper comprehension of the program, true critical paths and subcritical paths, which we will look at but primarily in the analysis, not ignoring outliers and other risks that impact non-critical path activities. But our principal focus in a QS array needs to work around critical and subcritical paths because they are the likely ones that will drive the outcomes. We need to consider the variety of delivery capabilities and in-country experience. We've had several instances where we're doing work in what are probably not developed world countries, where in developed world countries, we talk about the production of housing units. They take detailed interaction with your councils, your third-party stakeholders, your environment sectors. These are actually critical drivers on the construction path. Whereas in less developed areas of the world, you don't have as many complications with the third-party stakeholders. They're often able to throw up sounds. Sorry, one second. Sorry, the duties of working from home. So in less developed countries, we find that the accommodation blocks are standard. They can build them very quickly and put a very standard build, whereas the more complicated environments, like which require working parts, your swimming pools, take Brazil, the green pool, a lot of these elements are less understood by the in-country teams, whereas so you just need to be very aware of that. And you need to draw on experience from similar programs, such as Brazil, of what went wrong, and you need the project teams to come with that experience when you're trying to do those analysis. Next slide, please. Okay, there's a critical part to influencing a program is we need to understand the funding processes. If we don't understand the decision-making process and the funding timescales and streams, we will, by undertaking the analysis and not having the sponsor take it forward, we'll miss our window of influence. You'll miss the opportunity to inform key decisions and influence any acceleration that might be required because it simply will be too late. Again, alluding to Matthew's previous graphic about if you try and change course too late, you can't. Under fixity of delivery expectations, I think it's very hard to determine whether a project is influenced by a time critical element. Every project will tell you it's time constrained and time critical. There's always a balance. However, most projects balance time, cost, quality. An effective QSRA tends to work. I have found an effective QSRA works best where a program is definitively time bound, such as there is an Olympics opening ceremony, or we have a possession of an operational infrastructure, nuclear shutdown, or railway possessions. These environments are where a QSRA actually, the output of that has direct influence on the behaviors and the management of the project. So part of effective QSRA planning is to understand the flexibility of your absolute project limits, whether you have time, cost, or quality limits. Every project will tell you that there is no flexibility in time, cost, or quality. However, what's the point of doing a QSRA other than tell you that you'll probably fail unless you can influence one of the other elements to ensure that you can deliver on time? So the next part that I put there is that it's fundamental to understand how the boundary to the phase that you're trying to influence operates with the next boundary. If you're in a construct phase, what does the testing structure look like? Can it be blended? Can you crash that program? Can you prioritize certain elements and make sure that the testing program is managed in a different way to the general plan, which is handover and test? There must be batched elements of testing that you can develop. So it is critical to understand how the project delivery will integrate with the next phase. Again, you can bleed the project phases. Thanks. Outputs. Okay. So more often than not, I think I've always worked in an environment where we produce internal discipline reports, and we assume that this internal discipline report hits the right note and it goes to the right audience and they understand what they're looking at. I firmly believe that the results of a QS array should be more of an integrated project evaluation report. So this is where the sponsor needs to take the outputs, presenting the context, consequences, and any decisions that are now required. Standalone document, unfortunately, unfortunately can be overlooked, can just be part of a process and a box ticking exercise. Planners, okay, so this is where risk management is not a standalone process, and we should not be used as a schedule checking exercise. We need planners to do a discipline review of their material. They need to be critical of their own. Sorry, I've got it there. So planners should also provide a discipline-based critique of the current schedule to identify areas of weakness and lack of development. They will know. They will know better than the risk person. We can only work with the output of the planner to do the risk analysis on the schedule that we have received. However, we cannot necessarily deep dive the entire schedule and find where the planner has not drawn out enough information, has not got the information, hasn't got the experience. We need them to undertake a detailed critique of their own plan to support the risk analysis that goes forward. They sit hand in hand on a project evaluation report. Lastly, when delivering results, we need to consider the audience that we're talking to. Often they will be analysis and output naive. They'll never have seen the output before. And if they have, they might not have used it to support a decision. They might not know what to do with it. And they might just think it's a pretty graph or ask for a P80. At least they're asking for a P80, but do they really understand how variable that P80 can be and how unsolid an assessment can be unless the process has been validated with good participation, high engagement. There's a large part of critique that can go to the process of QSRA. So I think that the audience that receive the output need to have that critical mind when they receive the output, rather than, it shouldn't be a warm comfort blanket that they've got a P80. It should be this P80 is solid, or this P80 is not that solid, therefore we need to do further development. It should come with a recommendation on the quality of the P80. Lastly, we want to simplify our explanations and graphs. These are going beyond our program directors into executive bodies. They are not going to read the detail. They're not going to come and ask you questions. We need to make sure that our communication is succinct, clear, and different to what we would talk to how we would speak to a project specialist, especially a risk discipline specialist. Okay, and my last sort of point is you'll never hear of a project benefiting from great risk analysis, which led to effective decisions being taken by the project team. If you've done your job well, you won't hear the success of risk management. You will just hear the success of the project. You need to understand that we contribute to the success of the program, but we don't drive it. Risk analysis only informs decision making by the project team, and we can do our best, communicate better, and work more collaboratively and get higher engagement in our process. But that's the limits of risk management undertaking a QSRA, in my opinion. Next slide. Any questions? Thank you.
Thank you, Dave. Thank you, Dave. So we've had loads and loads and loads and loads of questions in. So what I'm going to do now, so if Francis, Matthew, and Dave, just if you all unmute yourselves. So what I've done is I've grouped. What I'm going to ask is first of all, if I don't cover any of your questions or specific points, please contact the people directly on LinkedIn. But just a couple of things first. So, like, I was keeping an eye on the attendees and including the panelists. At one stage, we sort of peaked just over 75, which was amazing. Sort of, it's been a very, very popular webinar, and it's been great to hear real insights from real practitioners, and you'll hear from across Matthew, Francis, and Dave. They've all done this and as well. We managed, and unfortunately, you, Dave, we managed to mention COVID once, so I was hoping we wouldn't mention it. We mentioned it once, that's fine, and that's great. So I've grouped the questions I've picked out sort of 4 themes. So, and what I was going to do is go through each in turn, and I'll do it in the order of Matthew, then Francis, and David. If you said a few words on each. The first top subject I've sort of grouped it together. It's not around, part of our role is to effect change, to make, change people's behaviours, actions, and some of the problems that come up. People use words like accountability, culture, engagement, focusing on outcomes rather than output. So I was going to ask you, each of you in turn, if you could offer maybe some advice, some hints and tips, how to overcome some of those barriers and make change in the organisation. The second theme is about time. It's a very good question, actually. Very much we have limited time with key stakeholders, and I was going to ask again, any hints or tips on, how do you make the most of that 30 minutes? You might have 30 minutes or 60 minutes with the project director or the project manager or functional area. So that's the second question. Third is, come up with a few questions around complex risk. Any advice or hints on tips on how to explain a complex risk to somebody, how to break it down. And then fourthly, a few questions around software and databases. So, in the times we are now, a lot of things done virtually. So if there are any other maybe useful pieces of software that you've come across to promote that interaction in terms of the risk work, and also if there are any databases. So in terms of, are anybody aware of any databases or data sources that people can tap into as well? So there are the 4 questions. So I'll go back to the first one and I'll just repeat it, and I'll ask Matthew and then Francis and then David. So again, the first one's about making change. Somebody noticed actually very good that actually in Matthew's job title the word risk does not appear, so you might have a different viewpoint on this. Is any hints and tips on how we should go about our role about making some of those changes to people's behaviours and actions? So if I go to Matthew first, any hints or tips or advice?
John mute.
Yeah, Matthew, on mute. Yeah, that's better.
There we go. So you had to unmute me there. Thank you.
Okay.
So change management. Look, in my view, any change management is 100% effort. There's lots of different methodologies, and different people will tell you different ways to approach it. But I think it does come down to just, you need to show that you're providing value to whoever you're in front of or whatever you're trying to affect change of. It is just about getting out to people, sharing the vision, getting people across the line, tackling the barriers, whatever you've identified, because every individual is going to have their own history, their own, a lot of people think that the project team members are automatons whose only purpose is to generate value for the project, but actually everyone has got their own careers in mind, and they have different paths, there's politics involved. So it really is a lot of experience, but gauging those soft skill sets and getting an idea of what's happening around the people in the project that you're dealing with, because the person might have the title but may not have the actual power because of some struggle that's happening. You just need to be aware of all of that stuff. That's my
excellent.
Yeah.
No, and it is a difficult question to answer. Francis, any hints or tips or advice to offer up?
Yes, I've got a couple of things that I would like to highlight. So the first one is, I think, like I spoke about in my presentation, we don't just deal with organizations as a project. You have a project organization, and there's a wider enterprise level organization. So for example, where I work, you've got engineering affairs, and then outside that, you've got guys who do revenue, HR, and they've all got their separate set of risks. So in terms of change management, what I would say is, firstly, don't be afraid to be provocative, right? Don't be afraid to be provocative. So what I mean by that is, sometimes people are used to red, amber, green heat maps, things that are you're highlighting on a monthly basis, but no one takes notice. So sometimes in that situation, the best thing is to be provocative. So use the right words. We will fail, we will fail, Don't be afraid to use provocative words to describe the situation you might face. We might fail. This could be a catastrophe. So those kind of things get people, excited and, actually start paying attention to the kind of information you're putting out there. I've seen, how many times have we presented information to senior management where you've got the same red risks that have been on the register for 6 months and nothing gets done about it. The red risks, they're supposed to be, top of your priority list, but it's like, okay, well, someone's handling it. So I think that's one of the things. Be provocative. Don't be scared to be provocative in the way you present information, in the language you use in your reports, in the language you use to actually present this information to senior management. And then secondly, as well, I'll just say there's a very powerful statement that I read the other day that captures risk in a way I haven't thought about before. Again, this is looking at the wider organization. So it goes something like this. So we take risks to create value. So you have to take risks to create value, and we manage risks to protect that value, right? So if you look at that side, it just encapsulates what we are all about. So you have to take risks to create value and assets, profits, whatever your organization looks at in terms of value, perspective of value from your organizational perspective. And we need to manage risk to protect that value or preserve that value. So I think that's a very powerful statement that can we use as well to explain the importance of risk management within organizations.
Excellent. And Dave, any insights or advice?
Yeah, okay, on a personal sort of note, I think I've always found it, I tend to find myself playing a part where I live as a pessimist. Like Francis was saying, don't be afraid to be provocative, but we're often the custodians of the doomsday message. We are anti-culture in terms of we're on time, we're on target, this is going to be done. We're the devil on the shoulder that's saying, actually, you really need to consider that this might not go correctly. And we've all sat together. I've just acted like a translator for your voice, and listening to you, we've come up with a very negative picture of the same story that you're selling. It's very hard not to be a negative voice in that environment. So I think, despite the voice and the sort of message often being negative, you've got to be seen as a positive influence within the program as a person, for them to trust that you're driving to achieve the same goals as them, despite your output often being a slant that doesn't necessarily fit with the general sort of optimism that needs to happen within the project to get a delivery over the line. How else would I influence? To get your personal influence up on the project, and as a risk person, it really does help if you're a jack of all trades and you can help people. They will turn to you as a Excel expert first before they'll necessarily turn to you as a risk person more often, is how I've managed to integrate, or going to them with a planning problem and improving their comprehension of the plan. And you've got to use your skill set as a risk person and get yourself recognized as a valuable asset within the team before then you can start to beat the drum about the risk. I want champions for risk management. The value of risk is here. I think you can demonstrate the value in other aspects of the project, and then they'll turn to you further down the line as a valuable entity when you're critiquing their work.
Okay, no, it's good. The next question I said for is about time. So you can imagine time is always quite precious. You've got a 30-minute or 60-minute time slot with somebody. Any advice on how to make best use of that time, in particular when you're trying to talk about a particular risk or review a risk or something like that? I'll do it the same order. Matthew first. These are all difficult questions.
Yeah, and yeah, presentation, probably one that I would struggle with most. I guess the big thing is it really have to tie it to the audience. You've got to use their words. If you can, you have to approach it from their perspective. If you're talking to somebody above, you need to start with the key insight or the key thing, and then ask them whether they want to go into the detail. Instead of starting, I think, with the buildup of the story, as many people like to do. But if you're talking on the other side to somebody who's within a project team, maybe you do probably need to set the context and provide a lot of detail around the insight before you give it to them. So I'd say that your time management and how you approach things is it really needs to be based off of that.
That's great. Francis, thanks, Matthew. Francis, anything else to?
Not really. I think I just want to hammer on the point that it's all about knowing your audience. So knowing a perspective on things. So the same kind of information you present to the executives will be different from what you present to the project participants, or program manager, project manager. So that's it really. So know your audience and package the information in such a way that your audience will find it most impactful.
And Dave?
Okay, this is quite interesting actually, because recently we've had, with the COVID constraints hitting the projects and people working from home, what we've found is a very significant uptake in people's attention, engagement in project controls practices, risk management interventions, largely because people are forced to focus. We've got people that are working from home, not on site, so therefore when they are engaged, or when we have arranged meetings, they're directly focused on what we're talking about. So we're actually getting a lot more quality of review and quality of input in this phase now than we often get when you're on site or you're in the office, where there's 101 other distractions that mean that the program manager doesn't turn up on time, that you get various people leaving to take phone calls. So I find that I personally have found that in this environment that we've got a lot better interaction with the project controls processes. I think there's a lot to be taken from this phase now, where we're doing remote working with very focused output meetings, and we've got to try and blend this back into the project environment when we walk back into the office. It's not easy wherever you are to make sure that you get a fair, optimized engagement out of people in the time that you book. I find myself more often than not just being available for people to talk when they're available, and making a window of opportunity for them to talk to me. It's not an easy thing to resolve.
No, that's correct. No, some useful advice there. This is probably going to be the third question. Is probably the most difficult, and it came up a few times when Matthew was presenting about complex risks, because if you look about it, it's never as simple as one individual cause leading to one individual effect. In real life, it's all interrelated, all of it. So I suppose a few questions around where you need any hints and tips and advice where you need to explain perhaps a complex risk to maybe somebody who isn't an expert, and you're trying to get that decision out of them. So difficult question, but again, I'll go in the same order. Matthew, any advice or hints?
Yeah, well, I mean, I've got quite a bit on this. So first thing, you need to sort of separate between complicated and complex. So if something's just has lots of moving parts to it, but is predictable, then that's a lot different than something that is complex in nature, which is a lot harder to predict outcomes. Everything's moving, and again, your audience, if it's somebody who's coming from a place where they have that history of wanting to have that predictability and that linear sort of control and outcome, and they're moving into a space where that's a lot harder to come by because it's a complex environment, then it does take a little bit of education around, well, you have all these actors at play, things are going to come up, and going into that decision theory piece, that's going to impact how you delegate authority down to different parties, and what's appropriate versus not. So you can create risk just by having your decision rights set at the wrong levels. That has nothing to do with the activities on the ground until those decision rights come into play. You know, the reason I started the journey and split up the risks in those 4 categories was to help those kinds of processes, to help people grasp into, well, complexity isn't one big beast. There's actual technical side of it. There's a structural side. So I found that that was a good way to get people into a level of comfort where they can start grasping some of the you know, how the controls needed to be different. And again, because, you know, the method I used was to try to align with, well, if it's a technically complex thing that we're talking about, well, that's a different person that you should maybe bring into the discussion, or it should have a different escalation path versus a, you know, an issue with the client, which might just need to get raised to another, you know, seniority level. So that's probably as quick as I can do it, but I've got quite a bit on this, so I could probably talk for quite a while.
No, Francis, what about yourself? Can you offer any insights or advice in a sense that trying to explain maybe a complex, or as Matt said, or sometimes even complicated risk to somebody?
Yeah, so I think from my perspective, when you talk about complicated risks, talking about risks with correlation, secondary impacts. So when there's quite a lot of interaction, it's not just a single risk that, so there's a chain effect and all that kind of stuff. So I think from my perspective, I like to keep it really, really simple. So anything graphical to explain the interaction of risks or the complexity around the risk. It's a very useful tool. I found it very useful in explaining correlation, for example, in some of my models. So you would know that apart from the stuff that we do with a client, the internal AECOM as well, we've got our own registers. So recently I started introducing correlation modeling into some of the cost models that we developed for the contract. And having to explain that to somebody who doesn't know what correlation is, tried some of these graphical tools to explain, you know, things moving together, that kind of stuff. So anything that's graphical, simple to understand, and don't be afraid to try it with some of your colleagues, you know, before you actually present it to senior management. So if you have something that you know you're going to present, make sure you try it with some of your colleagues before you present it to the big bosses or executives.
Excellent. Thanks, Francis. And Dave?
I don't really have much to say. I find breaking down a complex risk into its driving parts and looking at the influences. I really did like Matthew's model there with the types of risk complexity in phases. I thought that was actually really an interesting way to digest how you'll communicate where your risk influences are. And you might be in phase 1 looking at your technical risk, but actually you don't have enough appreciation over your construction risks that are going to come later on. I think that was actually really good. I find most risk discussions end up being complex risk discussions. If you're talking about outputs or you're talking about the mechanism of the risk and how in an analysis or in modeling you'll have complex. No, I'm going to pass on this one. Thank you.
No, I appreciate it. One thing, I was looking across my screen. So if people haven't come across it before, one useful tool is sometimes the use of bow ties. So, and I'm just looking across on my screen because I know, for example, and bow ties have sort of come from systems engineering, systems safety world. So there is a webinar from the Safety and Reliability Society, I know tomorrow evening, or you can Google it. And I know some risk software products, I won't name them, do have some of that functionality. And sometimes it's a useful way to show somebody there's that domino effect. And sometimes those interrelationships, particularly between causes as well, and effects. So if you haven't, most of you will have, but if you haven't, Google bow ties, have a look, and next time you're trying to explain something complex, maybe use it, as well. And that takes me on.
Second that, and sorry, Dan,
yeah.
Darren, you did a very good piece of bow tie analysis on Hinkley Point when we were there, and actually watching it work well is very value adding when you're doing a lot of the deeper, high level risk analysis. You did a very good job of that there.
Does that compliment cost me money? No, maybe not. So that takes us on to the last question. And it's about there were a few questions about software databases, and I suppose as I said, in the times we are, it's about keeping that. Is it like Francis' little tool? I think we'll all be using it or having a look at it later today. But software tool. So, but if you any other piece of software that you come across to maybe help visualize risk, maybe engage people, or maybe sometimes are there any databases or sources of risk you can help validate some of the assessments you're doing as well? That was one of the questions. So if again, I'll do it in the same order. Matthew, in terms of bit software or databases.
Yeah, so I don't have the qualifications to promote a software, I think, but one of the things just in line with my presentation that I'll just stress, there's an interesting feature around automation of processes and so on. So part of my presentation was about digital engineering, and it was around automating the interfaces between, you know, program software and you know, maybe your cost platform or weather data, and integrating that into, you know, your program or specification programs into your BIM model or whatever it might be. One of the things that there's quite a bit of research on now is that automation actually can be a detriment it can create its own risks, because when people don't understand what's actually happening within the processes, you know, it won't happen at first on day one, but after a little while, there'll be nobody left who understands what happens between A and F. You know, nobody understands B or C, and it'll create a risk down the line. So that's the only thing I want to, I think, maybe add to this that question.
Excellent. Thanks, Matthew. And Francis, anything?
Yeah, I think in terms of software, I would also not go out of my way to recommend any software. But what I would say is that trying to standardize things and create generic databases or sources of information can also be quite a difficult path to take, because what you want to avoid is people getting into the groupthink mindset where, you know, you've got a certain type of project, therefore these are the risks. That you want to avoid that as well. So I think from our perspective, the stuff I talked about earlier, the RBS, is quite a useful tool to start the process of putting together the thinking behind capturing risks. So not the actual risks, but what kind of things I should be thinking about to capture those risks. So I think the focus should be more on how you think to get the right risks on the register, rather than having essentially a standard list of risks or generic risks.
That's good. Thanks, Francis. And Dave?
Okay, having worked across a multitude of projects and clients, I've basically used an awful lot of the systems, and they are much of a muchness. You can go from, I think you have to appreciate what the tool is used for and what it's best for. There are many risk databases that are good for managing risk identification and prioritization, but they're not good for analysis. However, every tool is trying to become a jack of all trades, so they're all trying to build in or retrofit a risk analysis, a cost risk analysis, or a schedule risk analysis tool, whereas actually you've got siloed softwares that are really good at one, but not very often good at another. So I would endeavor to encourage people, first steps, to get a good database tool. You know, accessibility, whether that's in-house or off the shelf. The off-the-shelf ones are simple and decent. They will do for most people in most environments. However, you know, building it yourself gives you an awful lot of control and authorship that you might not have elsewhere, but that's incredibly labor intensive. And, you know, we're not software developers really, so therefore, you know, we do tend to go off the shelf. But I would focus first on a good database tool. Secondly, I'd look at a integrated cost and schedule tool. There are plenty on the market, and yeah, we're not salespeople. Cheers.
Can I maybe just something to add, if I could, to that, because David, as you were talking, it did make me think of something. A lot of analysis around risks and programs and finance and everything else seems to be moving very quickly towards the data lake that all of these systems are now dumping into. And so you've got you know, data scientists that are creating algorithms to just draw out correlations between you know, weather data and, you know, whatever else. So it might be that the systems become, you know, a very big non-event at the end of the day, and everybody just starts pulling out of this one big data lake in the very near future.
Excellent.
So everybody should learn Amazon Web Services.
That's fine. So on that note, I'm just looking at the time. So it's been, so I'll go back to my thank yous as I said at the start. So first of all, a big thank you to the folks on, you can see on the screens, for investing their time, pulling together the slides. We always underestimate how long it takes to produce these slides. We always think we can reuse something we had before. Big thanks to Matthew, Francis, and Dave. A big thank you as well to the IRM folks in the background. I know particularly Rory and Juliet for helping to sort of help make these webinars happen in the background. And as well, finally, to all of our attendees. Even now at the end, we're sort of including panelists. We're sort of over 50. We peaked, as I said, over 75. So hopefully, if I press the right button, and it has gone wrong before, we will save this recording and you will get a link. Plan B, you get the slides. So so on that note, and particularly from this part of the world, Eid Mubarak as well. So thanks everybody. Have a great day. Leading into a great weekend. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you.
Take care. Stay safe.
Thank you.